and I are here with Heather Cox Richardson, who really needs no introduction. She's one of America's most influential historians and public intellectuals, the author of Letters from an American, which is one of the biggest and most impactful newsletters on Substack. Through her writing and commentary, she really provides deep historical context for current events, I think, is a leading interpreter of the moment we are in right now because she can pull that context in. And especially as the U.S. is coming to mark its 250th anniversary, her work and her insights on the meaning of the American experiment and the relationship, frankly, between America's democratic institutions and our place in the world, in the universe, is really important. So these are all light topics. We're going to talk a little about foreign policy, a little about the United States, a little about the present, the future, a little about history in the next bit. So Heather, we're excited to be with you. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon to join us.
Well, back at you, but I warn you, I have probably more questions for you than you have for me. So let's see where we go.
That sounds good. John, you wanna kick us off, and then Heather, feel free to pose your questions too. But I'll turn it over to you to start.
I will, and yeah, we'd love the back and forth. So thanks again for being with us. You issued a pretty stark warning in your Juneteenth essay. I'll just read it. We are in danger of losing the new nation that it celebrated. That's pretty striking, and just was wondering if you could expound on that a little bit and tell us what you mean and why we should be so concerned.
I don't think it's any secret that the Trump administration, not only Donald Trump himself, but his appointees and those people who support him, are actively making war on American democracy, especially the American democracy that we have established since 1933, really the modern world in which we all live. And you can see that really dramatically, of course, with the Supreme Court decision yesterday, that the Slaughter decision that gives the president a power that he has not had since 1935, when we had the beginnings of this growing government, to remove the heads of agencies, not just political appointees, but other people working for agencies that are housed in the executive branch, despite the fact they're created by Congress. So what I meant by that is if you look broadly at the ways in which the Supreme Court and the administration are working to tear apart the machinery of our government, we could lose those fundamental principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence, that in our democracy, we have a right to be treated equally before the law, to have a say in our government, and to have equal access to resources. And, I'd love to hear someone make the other side of the argument. I know some people say, well, this is just business as usual, but it certainly is not business as usual. So that's where I was going with that.
And do you think, Heather, we were talking briefly before we came on, and we just had Bob Kagan. We did a live show at the Aspen Ideas Festival and spent time with him. And he was making the case that how we relate to our democratic experiment at home has an impact on how we approach things in the world. It has an impact on how others see us. It has an impact on how we see ourselves as a global power. Do you think that's right? Or would you amend that? How do you relate those observations you were just making about the state of our democratic experiment here to how you see the United States operating as a global power?
So this is a great question because it's of real concern to me. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. It's a real concern to me that it doesn't seem to me that the American people spends a great deal of time worrying about foreign policy. Would you agree with that?
I would say generally, although the one area where they tend to really dial in is if the United States is actually at war.
Okay, that's a good point.
And I think there is, in the post 9/11 period, in those years, there was more appetite for risk and adventurism abroad, the willingness to go fight over there because people were so worried about security back here. I think now we're in a phase where this Iran war, for example, was unpopular from the minute it started, which is, I think, kind of without precedent. Almost every war ultimately becomes unpopular, but starts out with a pretty broad support of the American people. So I think on that issue, the American people have made their opinion pretty clear. On other things, I would tend to agree that it is definitely not at or near the top of the list of folks' primary concerns. Yeah.
I guess where I was going with that was less the wars. Although the story I'm going to tell you, I've never told before. So I was trying to do something new in every interview. So you're getting a good one.
Right. All right.
But the general theories behind international relations and foreign affairs are really important to the survival of American democracy and of systems all over the world that support democratic input into their systems. And people sort of seem, I think, to have forgotten that there are those systems and that we should weigh in on those systems and what effects they have on our lives. And what I'm really focusing on, of course, is the post-World War II rules-based international order, which I actually don't want to go into right now because I want to tell you this story. But we're losing that. And when we lose freedom of the seas, which of course Churchill and FDR laid out in 1941 in the Atlantic Charter, although it had an earlier history than that as well. When we lose the free trade that the freedom of the seas supported, the impacts on the United States are going to be huge. And Donald Trump came in and just sort of said, well, we're going back to William McKinley's era. I study William McKinley's era. There's no reason to go back, I promise. Um, but in terms of that larger question of whether people are paying attention, I've always wondered if it was the 1947 consolidation of the national security state that made so much of what we do secret or what the United States does secret, that people stopped sort of paying attention. They only saw what was in the news and they either liked it or they didn't like it, but they didn't have that deeper understanding. What do you think of that?
Was your sense before 1947 that, in fact, these debates or deliberations in Washington took place with greater transparency than they did after 1947?
Well, with caveats, yes, because of course the presidents have always hidden things. But think about the fact that the last time we declared war was during World War II, right?
Yeah.
And there's a reason that we're supposed to have those conversations. And, the framers of the Constitution were very clear that they wanted Congress to debate the idea of going to war, not only because it would take people's lives, but also because having a permanent military or expending cash in war would destroy the home, destroy the economy at home. And, you look at the fact that, we're in this war in Iran that nobody approved except the president and perhaps Pete Hegseth and some of his other advisors. And we're just pouring money into that. So aside from even the lives at stake, the real fear that we can cripple an economy based on a war that we don't want is something that the framers would have been all over.
It's
So where I
interesting
think,
that. Oh, sorry.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead, John.
Well, where I think you're right is I do think you can date the beginning of the shift of kind of the center of gravity in national security and foreign policy decision making from Congress and the executive branch working in tandem to really an executive branch dominated decision making process to that post war period. But if I'm being candid, and I think Jake would probably agree with this, the people who have actually been responsible for making foreign policy since then, we include ourselves, I guess, in this category, I think bear some responsibility for this disconnect because there has been a sort of implicit or explicit leave this to us, I think, mentality that doesn't necessarily apply to other areas of American policy, maybe in part because some of this is based on classified information that can't be shared. But in part, I think because this post-war order that you described, we believed collectively was so advantageous to us that we didn't really need to make the case to the American people about how great it was. They would just understand it intuitively and implicitly. And they actually, I think, lost track of and came not to believe anymore that this was all in our interest. And along comes somebody like Trump who actually says it's a raw deal, it's more of a burden than a benefit. And there was fertile ground for that because we stopped, I think, explaining and making the case for why it was important. That'd be my partial explanation.
I think that's right, and I'm on board with that. I try and do foreign affairs as much as I possibly can, just because it's so important, and I don't think people know as much as they should about it. But let me tell you the story that goes back to your question about the relationship between domestic politics and foreign affairs, and that's that when the United States gets involved in Cuba, and I'm going to make the argument here that what we know of as the Spanish-American War is really two entirely different wars. There's the war in Cuba and there's the war in the Philippines, because the people who supported those two wars were entirely different groups of people in the United States. But what's interesting is that Teddy Roosevelt, for example, and the interventionists in Cuba desperately wanted to go into Cuba because of the humanitarian crisis there, because you had, the Spanish colonial leaders concentrating people. It's when we get one of the first uses of the word concentration camps, right? They're concentrating people into these camps where they're dying in horrific numbers. And they insist that the United States has become a country of shopkeepers and people who are only interested in money, and that they need to exert moral authority in Cuba to become to renew their own principles at home. And of course, we have that very famous scene at the Gridiron Club in Washington D.C. when where the politicians used to go to be roasted by the journalists, in which Teddy Roosevelt stands up and he shakes his hand at Mark Hanna, who is the really McKinley's handler, and says, we will have this war for Cuba, even if the moneyed interests don't want us to do it, because the sugar interests didn't want people to go into Cuba. But what's interesting to me about that and the connection to the American domestic scene is that coming out of Cuba, which was for the United States what John Hay, the Secretary of State, called a splendid little war, right? It was very quick, it was very successful. In fact, at one point, there's the U.S. Navy wins because the other side doesn't even know they're at war, right? The coming out of that, the people who become known as the imperialists who want to spread American values overseas, and that's going to include Teddy Roosevelt and people like Henry Cabot Lodge out of Massachusetts, but crucially, it's going to include Albert Beveridge in Indiana, who becomes, most of us read him in high school, the March of the Flag speech about how we have to go take over all these poor, benighted countries. That's his words, not mine. Their big argument for that was partly about how, yeah, we got to spread democracy and religion and so on. But an awful lot of their argument was, if we're going to do these things, if we're going to spread American values, we must clean up the United States at home. Mm. And so one of the big arguments behind the progressive reforms under Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century was, we can't preach citizenship and capitalism and religion and all these things and citizenship overseas unless America looks like we're doing it at home. And that was actually really powerful as an argument for taking over the rest of the world. And it's kind of not the entire rest of the world, but because the U.S. isn't involved in the fight for Asia, for example, but for Russia, for example, but Asia, I'm sorry. But that whole working backward of if we're going to go take other countries, but if we're going to go take other countries, we got to fix up America first, is kind of a backward approach to imperialism, but it really was a driving force behind progressivism. Is that going to happen now? I haven't seen a single person making that argument.
Well, you could make the argument, in fact, that we are in some ways not preaching democracy and citizenship abroad, but actually preaching and befriending authoritarianism abroad as we impose it at home. So almost the inverse of what you describe, a less democratic, more authoritarian society in America that is leading us into league with less democratic and more authoritarian countries around the world under this president.
Josh Marshall yesterday called it Greater MAGA. Putin in Russia, and of course, Viktor Orban is no longer in control of Hungary, but the different authoritarian regimes across the world. But maybe that gives us a different way to think about the relationship between foreign affairs and the domestic scene now, if you think about it, because Putin's in real trouble. Like, he's in real trouble. And if he goes down, Rick Wilson was saying that, of course, aside from the economics of whether or not he goes down, and, Belarus has just refused to enter the war and appears to have appealed to China for protection against Russia. It's unclear to me what's really going on there. This is your field, not mine. But if Putin goes down, aside from anything else, all the files that are in his administration's possession suddenly seem to me, as Rick Wilson suggested, to become extraordinarily valuable for getting people out of legal trouble or possibly out of the country. And I wonder if him going down is going to do great damage to those other countries that have relied on him for money or propaganda support. And I'd be shocked if that didn't include the U.S. What do you think?
Well, a few things here. One, it's definitely the case, and we saw it during our time in government, that Russia continues to put money into commentators, political figures, other people, including in the US, but across the world, to try to shape the debate, sow division, undermine democracy, and also support far right movements. And I think Putin is a critical player in that because he's sort of the avatar, the symbol for a lot of these folks across Europe and folks, including in the MAGA movement here in the United States. So that's definitely a real factor. And it is interesting, Heather, that people who are not prone to hyperbole or prone to exaggeration are now saying about Putin's position in the Kremlin in Moscow that, look, he's not maybe going to fall tomorrow, but that he is in a weaker, more pressurized place than he has been in a long time. So I definitely think that that bears watching. When you were talking earlier, I just wanted to put a plug in for Mary Dudziak's book called Cold War Civil Rights, because the story you were telling about the progressive era, she tells about the civil rights movement and the Cold War and how the Cold War actually led to a series of arguments here at home about how we had to make progress on civil rights, because how could we make this case of freedom versus communism if we weren't cleaning up our house at home? So this has a long pedigree. And as John was saying, we may be seeing it in exact reverse today. But I thought that was really quite striking. And then, not to jump all over the place, but before we actually press the live button, we started a conversation about Mark Carney's speech at Davos, where he talked about a rupture in the international system. And he said the old order is not coming back. That was his phrase. And basically said Canada and countries like it, middle powers like it, are going to have to build these new coalitions that frankly don't depend on America. In some way could be seen as adversarial to America, depending on how things develop. And use this phrase variable geometry, which we were talking about. What's your read on that? You were talking about this post-war era, how it's changing. Mark Carney's essentially declared it dead. Did you read Carney's speech, and what was your take on his observation or the strategy that he was putting forward?
I did read. I actually wrote about his speech as well. I'm following Carney really closely because if you're in a period in which something's falling apart, you want to watch for the people who are articulating a new way forward, not simply doing it, but articulating it. At least because of the way I see the world, it takes people's ability to articulate a new vision for others to join it. So I have been watching him. Before I want to say that, though, I want to pick up what you just said about the idea that the Cold War amplified the drive for civil rights. And I want to make a caveat to it that I think really matters. 100%. Yeah, I mean, it was just a no-brainer, right? That you couldn't fight against fascism and then live a version of it at home. But the Cold War actually did not advance civil rights for women. It
Right.
tended to reinforce traditional rights for women because, as one historian has very famously said, you could see on TV that all of the women in Russia, this is her phrase, not mine, looked like Mr. Potato Head. And this is when you get, the whole idea of women in poodle skirts and, so on. So there's a real disconnect there between civil rights for Black and brown men and for women that
Wow.
the Cold War really divides. But so the reason I'm interested in Carney actually goes to your work, the two of you, and what happened during the Biden administration and having Antony Blinken at the State Department, the head of the Secretary of State. Because to me, one of the best speeches and most important speeches that Biden gave was in February of 2021 when he was introducing,
At the State Department.
at the State Department. So, it's like February 4th or and he talks about the fact that you cannot that a couple of things. The old order, the post-World War II order is dead, he says, which we could talk about because that's interesting. But he was trying to replace it. With the idea, first of all, that you had to make democracy work at home. And that I think the Biden administration was ideologically extremely coherent. And it just didn't get the play in the media for people to see that it was coherent. He wanted to make democracy work at home. But then he also said that in order to combat, and I'm reading slightly into this because I don't think he used the word colonialism, but one of the things about post-World War II the rules-based international order is that it was inherently had a colonial mindset. That is, a few groups of wealthy countries were going to dictate to places like Africa, which until the Biden administration did not have a seat on the G20, which is bonkers, right? I mean, you know that. But so what they came up with, in my understanding, is they looked at how a bunch of countries could jockey and come up with coherent policies in what became the EU, where instead of having a largely top-down version of how they would cooperate, they would use variable geometry to say, listen, these 3 countries care about, I'm making this up, cheese, and these 6 countries care about shoes. And instead of everybody saying we're all going to have to be alike, you get these different people in different countries in ad hoc committees. But Biden and Blinken added the word diplomatic, that they were variable diplomatic geometry, with the idea that through diplomacy, you were going to be able to do this at a world level. And there were some profound successes in that. The way they treated fentanyl, for example. I actually think that a lot of the work that they did in Latin America, did in Latin America, got almost no press, but it was very successful. Vice President Kamala Harris's trip to Africa was one for the ages that got almost no press in the United States. But the problem with it always seemed to me was it was just a ducky idea until you had to force somebody to do something. And in that case, what the Biden administration rolled out were dramatic economic sanctions and expulsion from, like, the SWIFT banking system that enables countries to exchange money. But it didn't work in the case for example, of Israel and Gaza, where Biden was not willing to put those economic sanctions on Israel. That's my sense of it anyway. But then you've got Carney stepping in and saying, we're going to do this. We're going to do this variable geometry. What a terrible name, by the way. But we're going to do it without those big powers. Us middle powers are going to do it. And it's a very similar idea to what was going on at the EU, but I'm still back on that idea that if you try and put this together, you need teeth. And where are the teeth? The Canada and the EU, of course, have been working very closely together in trade, but is that enough teeth that you can force the United States, for example, to do something? And I don't know. I feel like getting that piece in place would give us a foreign policy for the future, but I don't see that piece yet. What do you think?
So I guess my answer to that would be you definitely need both carrots and sticks. It's a bit cliched, but it's actually the reality. And I think sometimes we, the United States, struggle on both ends of that. You're right that sometimes we lack maybe the political will to muster sufficient sticks when it's our friends who are involved. But we also, I think, have struggled to offer sufficient carrots sometimes to incentivize countries to work with us. In the modern era, it's a lot harder, for example, to offer countries access to the American market than it used to be because of the politics around trade in our country. What countries really want from us are closer economic ties, much more than almost anything else. They want American investment in their countries. We don't have the ability to direct that investment, to tell American companies, you will go here and you will go here. We don't have state-owned enterprises. We don't have sovereign wealth funds here the way some countries do to kind of channel large amounts of capital. So we have to use incentives, we have to use persuasion, but it's never direct and immediate in that way. Similar on the coercive side. And so I do think what's going to be interesting about this variable geometry of the middle powers that Carney is trying to muster is, will countries that are working together almost to try to reduce their reliance and dependency on the US, be willing to use these sorts of tools that we have used sometimes against them, sometimes with them, against us in the current moment. And I think they are trying to gauge whether they have the collective will and the willingness to take on the pain that will come with that, because sometimes it means imposing costs on your own population to try to coerce and change American decision making. Not clear to me that they will get there, but that is the conversation I think they're having right now.
And similarly, if you go to Europe now, they're having that conversation with respect to the US. They're also having that conversation with respect to China. And they are very worried about the extent to which basically China's overcapacity, the flooding of European markets with products across a range of different industries, is leading to the further hollowing out and deindustrialization of Europe. And I think they have been historically reluctant to use leverage, to have teeth, to your point. They have the latent capacity for it. Their economy's big enough, they have the leverage, but will they actually use it? I think the combination of what China is doing and what the US is doing right now may just get us a Europe, Canada, Japan, Korea, even India, a range of these middle powers that are democracies deciding to band together and exert the leverage they have to a greater extent than we have historically seen. But I think you put your finger on the critical question, because depending on whether they do or don't, so will go basically this variable geometry theory. If they don't do it, then that's their ability to shape or influence events is going to be extremely limited.
Didn't India and the EU do a huge trade
They
deal
did.
ago?
Yeah, Canada and India did one. The EU and India did one. And frankly, they couldn't get to the finish line for years and years and years because there was always some provision that one side or the other, didn't want to agree to. Nothing creates the get across the finish line momentum like Donald Trump and his trade war. And so they did. So, and if you just look at what Canada's doing with diversifying its economic relationships, trying to increase the level of investment into Canada from other countries, trying to create new markets that don't...
Including China, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. That don't make them as dependent on the U.S. I think they're taking those steps. The question is whether they will add to that these kind of trade countermeasures, targeted tariffs against certain kinds of products that are flooding into their markets, controls on certain kinds of investment. That's the big question for me as to whether they're prepared to do that.
So I have a question for you on that. Two questions. First of all, doesn't it make sense if you're trying to protect your supply lines at the very least to have targeted tariffs? I know a number of countries do. If you can build it, you could develop your own markets. Don't you develop your own production. Don't you want to do that?
John, I don't know if you want to...
Well, look, I think we voted with our feet on this question. We inherited a set of tariffs from President Trump, including some, candidly, that President Biden, when he was a candidate for president, said he didn't like very much. Ultimately, when we stared hard at this problem, there were some that we wanted to revise and many that we decided to keep, in large part for exactly the reason you just identified, which are there are a set of critical industries, critical elements of our supply chain that have to be made more resilient and more reliable. And tariffs are a part of the process of doing that, along with, by the way, some of these positive incentives and partnerships with countries around the world that are essential to those supply chains that are closer to, our way of thinking than China, where we had an unhealthy dependency for a long time and still do in some areas.
Can I ask you one? I know I don't know what your time looks like.
I think we should let you go.
We're getting
here
there.
In a sec.
Can I ask you one question, though? It's
sure.
A little one. It's a teeny tiny one. If you could design a U.S. foreign policy for the 21st century, simply, not in the weeds, but sort of this new philosophy that we're talking about here, what would it look like?
Well, historically, we had approached our idea of alliances and partnerships in a hub and spoke model. Basically, we would work with countries bilaterally. We would be in the middle and everyone would connect to us. I think my view would be basically we need a lattice work. And this is kind of like variable geometry, but basically connect everyone to everyone so that for any given international problem, you can collect the right group of countries to go tackle it. And so that if there are periods where the United States pulls back or pulls out, as we see with Donald Trump, and as you put it before with Greater MAGA, other countries can work more closely together and sustain the kind of international cooperation that makes for a more peaceful world. But fundamentally, when it all comes down to it, the core of U.S. foreign policy abroad has got to be work with allies and partners, because it is the only way we get the scale and leverage to solve any of the challenges that should matter to people here at home, including supply chain resilience, having the capacity to manufacture and innovate effectively, ensuring that we can deter wars and prevent wars in other places. So for me, it really comes down to a lattice work of allies and partners across the world that is flexible, that is problem-solving oriented. And if we could just do that with diplomacy first, it feels to me like we'd be on the right track.
John, you want to take
Heather,
a shot?
I just want to say I do think we should probably wrap up. I agree with how Jake described things. I wanted to end just by by saying something about your work, which I think I appreciate, and an energy that we would like to try to bring to our work as well, and that I think you brought to this conversation. You have a way of describing hard things that the country is going through without sounding despairing or hopeless, and while always offering counterpoints and ideas. And I think that's just so essential and appreciated in this moment. I don't know if that's intentional or just something that's in your nature, but I just wanted to call that out and say thank you for bringing that problem solving energy to this conversation. And we're big admirers and love to have you back
Bless you.
at some point. But thank you.
Would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks
All
so
right.
much.